the Riot, which we will be talking about the events that I'm sure we all remember from January 6th. My name is Miguel Centeno. I'm a professor in sociology and in the School of Public and International Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome Lou Jacobson tonight and a bunch of my very distinguished colleagues. Let me tell you a little bit about Lou. Lou has been with PolitiFact since 2009. He's currently a senior correspondent. He served previously on Roll Call and is founding editor of the legislative wire service, Congress Now. Earlier, he spent more than a decade covering politics, policy, Congress, and lobbying for National Journal magazine. In short, Lou actually doesn't need those little models that they had during the impeachment to find out where the West Wing and where the Senate is, et cetera. And of course, he graduated from Princeton in 1992 with a degree in public and international affairs. Lou, thank you so much for doing this, and good evening.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everybody. I'm going to start by having each of the participants give a couple minutes chat about how they want to approach the topic we're talking about tonight. We're going to start with Nell Painter, who is an Emerita professor of history at Princeton. She is the author of Standing at Armageddon, the United States, 1877 to 1919, as well as Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, and Creating Black Americans, African-American History and Its Meaning, 1619 to the Present. She has previously served as president of the Organization of American Historians and the Southern Historical Association. So I guess over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to join my colleagues. I'm a state away, but I'm glad to be here with you. I want to start by taking you back 40 years. Some 40 years ago, I was a Harvard graduate student researching the dissertation that became my first book, Exodusters, Black Migration to Kansas After Reconstruction, came out in 1977. My field was 19th century Southern history. The topic was the conditions at the end of Reconstruction that prompted tens of thousands of Southerners to leave their homes for Kansas, the state they knew as Free Kansas. These Louisianians, Mississippians, Texans, Tennesseans, and Kentuckians were refugees from the terrorism that, quote unquote, redeemed Southern states and restored the power of Democrats. My dissertation and my book were considered Black history, not American history. Redemption's tolls were murder and intimidation, what we call terrorism. For redeemers were well organized and well armed. As a Black Republican Louisianian testified to the US Senate, the white people in Louisiana are better armed and equipped now than during the war. And they have a better standing army now in the state of Louisiana than was ever known in the state. You see them parade the streets of New Orleans with their gray uniforms on and with their improved Winchester rifles and their Gatling guns. And they have everything now except the rebel flag, even to the gray uniform. This was the 1870s. I find it interesting that at that point, Redeemers were not parading under a Confederate flag. That would come later, even much later. I won't take you through the gruesome scenes of carnage in my book, but before I leave Exodusters, let me quote part of its flap copy. Words my editor at Knopf, Ashbel Green, saying that my account draws, quote, on neglected primary sources, quote, and that it testified to, quote, the spirit of a movement that has previously been denied its rightful place in American history, end quote. My editor, Ashbel Green. The historical record existed, but it had not been previously publicized. And even after I publicized it, my book was exiled from American history and Southern history, relegated to the then minor field of Black history. This, after all, was the 1970s. I researched my dissertation in Widener Library in the aftermath of upheaval. No, not the aftermath, because upheaval was still going on. Upheaval around the right to vote in states like Mississippi, and upheaval over the Vietnam War. No sooner had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 seemingly assured Black Americans full citizenship than carnage in Vietnam divided the country anew. Much of the opposition to the war revolved around the draft and the colonial nature of the conflict. Less often noted was the near novelty of a fully integrated American armed force. Until President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, the US Armed Forces had been either exclusionary or segregated. The very fact of multiracial forces attracted attention, notably from Thomas A. Johnson, 1928 to 2008, a pioneering Black journalist who covered Black service members for the New York Times. In 1968 and 1969, Johnson published several articles on the Negro in the Vietnam War. He noted the troops' spirit of interracial camaraderie. He also took note of the presence of outright racism and white supremacy. White racial animus appeared in journalism as a racial problem, therefore as something to be jettisoned ultimately onto the pile of the Black side, where it remained with my sources and analysis of the white political violence that had ended Reconstruction. Neither the white political violence of the 1870s nor white nationalism in the armed forces in the 1960s made its way into the broader national consciousness as American, as opposed to Black political issues. We are now nearly a century and a half from the end of Reconstruction and a generation or two from the Vietnam War. In the intervening years, politics in the US has become ever more subject to media attention as the media have become more varied and pervasive. The French language has a word for the intensification of visibility and attention paid to current events. French says politics has been médiatisé. An awkward translation speaks of politics being mediatized. Our recent public life has indeed been intensely mediatized, so that we see not only images of current events, but we hear their soundtracks accompanying moving images. Mediatization has crystallized images into indices of our recent past, of the 2020 election, of the 2021 runoffs, of the Capitol riot, into emblems carrying symbolic meaning. The intense mediatization of the politics of recent months has colorized American politics, has colorized American democracy. By exposing to the great American public the Americanness of issues that used to be hidden away as Black history and Black concerns. So on the one hand, my 1970s sense of writing ancient political history is proven false. Militarized political violence is not a relic of the American past. Here it is with us again, not only in the Capitol riot of January 6th, but also the besieging of state capitals in Oregon and Michigan. But in another way, what we are living through now is new. The intense mediatization of the 21st century has emblematized American democracy and colorized it with striking intensity. On the one hand, we have the exercise of voting rights crystallized in the symbol of the state of Georgia, where a grassroots movement personalized in the figure of one Black woman, Stacey Abrams, turned out thousands of voters standing in long lines to vote in November and again in January. Those voters were not exclusively Black, but the passionate determination of Black voters colorized as Black, the fundamental act of democratic citizenship, voting. On the other side was an insurrectionist mob intending to overturn the results of the political election through an assault on the home of American representative democracy, the Capitol. The face of this insurrection was not only angrily white, but also militarized through its remarkable cohort of white veterans. In short, the highly mediatized events of the last few months have colorized American democracy around voting. Voting is Black. Pro-democracy is colorized Black. Overturning the results of voting is white. Anti-democracy has been colorized white.
Thank you. We will now move on to Sean Malence, who is a professor of history at Princeton, studying US political and social history. He's the author of The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, and the Age of Reagan. He is currently writing The Triumph of American Anti-Slavery, which covers the period of the 17th century to 1865. All yours.
Thank you, Louis. It's great to see you at last. I
Thank you.
want to thank Elise for having brought us all together this evening. An auspicious event. I want to talk about January 6th in a somewhat different frame, mostly because in coming over here, I heard that for the first time that former President Trump actually went out and finally attacked Mitch McConnell, calling him a political hack, basically calling upon the Republican Party to dump Mitch McConnell, saying that the Republican Party can no longer win if this political hack is in charge. You might have been able to imagine that was going to happen after what happened at the impeachment trial. In the aftermath of that, with McConnell somewhat cynical, shall we say. And in fact, now we have, it's kind of Godzilla versus Rodan is shaping up between, Donald Trump, the demagogue, versus Mitch McConnell, the cynic. But I bring that up only because I think that I want to, well, in looking at January 6th, one of the ways to look at January 6th is to see it as both the culmination of the relatively recent history of the Republican Party and maybe even the future of the Republican Party. And let me explain briefly what I mean by that. The culmination of the Republican Party. Donald Trump's presidency, as we know, did not come out of nowhere. It really fed on or was the result of 30 years and more of Republican radicalization of Republican politics. We can go back, I could tell that story going all the way back, at least to the late 60s, as Nell was talking about it, but move it up to the mid 90s. Julian, among others, who was the expert on all of this, can talk maybe a little bit about Newt Gingrich, how Newt Gingrich really began the vulgarization, not vulgarization exactly, but the increased violence of American politics, I think, begins with Newt Gingrich in 1994, even before 94, going back to what Julian's writing about, him and Jim Wright. And then there was a process was touched off. Began with Gingrich as the party moved steadily to the right, always appealing to a base that had been brought in first under Nixon, then under Reagan, but was really, expanded in the 90s. And that became the base of the Republican Party in no uncertain terms. White Christian evangelicals had a lot to do with that base, but not just that. Nevertheless, it was a base that they were going to stoke, that they were going to ride to victory. So they thought they could keep on riding to victory. But they kept moving to the right, kept pushing further to the right, always promising more. In a process whereby, one group after another, one successful politician after another, found himself being undone by that process. The Republican leadership thought that it could ride to victory eternally on the back of this tiger that it had created and was going to stoke, but then was going to end up inside. And that's what I think happened actually finally with Donald Trump, except not quite entirely. It took January 6th to bring that all out, all right? So I think that, we can talk about this more, but I think that January 6th really was the culmination of the history of the party since the 90s. What we're seeing now, though, in this gigantic fight is really going to be quite interesting. In some ways, the trial was almost as fascinating to me, or more fascinating to me in some ways politically, than the events of January 6th themselves. Because now we really do have the Republican Party at the crossroads. And you saw that very clearly in Minority Leader McConnell's speech, in which he tried to, have it both ways, basically. Castigating Trump, but then deciding on a technicality not to vote for his impeachment. He had the opportunity at that point to purge the Republican Party, or to try to purge the Republican Party of Donald Trump. He decided not to do that. Once again, thinking that they can find a way out of this, to control, to ride the tiger. We haven't been eaten by the tiger. We are going to be able to figure out how to do this without really getting rid of them. We're going to keep them with us. Well, we will see what happened. But in doing that, in saying what he did, he invited Donald Trump to say what he said today, which is to say, it's between you and me. It's either going to be you, Speaker Minority Leader McConnell, or it's going to be me, Donald Trump, the president in exile, in effect. And I think that what we're looking out of January 6th, which was absolutely was Donald Trump's show of force, his show of power. He loved it. He incited it, everything that Liz Cheney said. This is going to be a battle royal inside the Republican Party. And, I wouldn't want to bet against Donald Trump. I wouldn't want to bet against this process continuing yet again, getting to the lowest possible point. I wouldn't want to bet against that at all. But that's what we're seeing today. It's, again, the cynic thought that he could hold on, but we're going to see if he's going to be able to do that against the demagogue. I'll hold off on that and turn it over to you, Lewis.
Thanks very much. Next, we're going to hear from Keith Whittington, professor of politics at Princeton. He's the author of Repugnant Laws, Judicial Review of Acts of Congress from the Founding to the Present, and Constitutional Construction, Divided Powers and Constitutional Meaning. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about these important events, both the events of January 6th, but as we've already indicated, a larger context that created the events of January 6th and that we're going to be living with for quite some time. I wanted to briefly mention the other aspect of January 6th, what happened before the riot, before the storming of the Capitol, which I think is easy to lose sight of, but I find quite distressing in itself. As a constitutional scholar, the process by which we are engaged in conducting politics now, I think has been quite disturbing in recent years. It has become much more disturbing over the last few weeks and months, and I think shows a very bad sign for the future. So what I'm referring to on what happened earlier on the day of January 6th is the counting of the electoral votes in Congress. The 12th Amendment of the Constitution specifies that when the state's electors meet in their state capitals and cast their ballots for the president and vice president, those ballots are then sent with certification of the results in each state to Congress. Congress then meets this year on January 6th in order to count those ballots and officially announce who won the election and who the president and vice president of the United States are. The current process that fleshes out the details of how we go about doing what the 12th Amendment says in very brief terms that Congress should do. The 12th Amendment merely specifies that the vice president will meet with the joint session of Congress and open the ballots, and the votes will be counted and then the results will be announced. But the Electoral Count Act, a federal statute, provides much more detail about what that looks like. The Electoral Count Act was adopted after Reconstruction and the fight over the contested presidential election of 1876, in which there was substantial misconduct by both parties, disagreements about who had won several state elections that ultimately led to competing slates of electors that had to be arbitrated. And at that point, they passed an ad hoc approach to dealing with it with the Electoral Commission of 1876. But subsequently, they eventually compromised to create a federal statute that was supposed to guide this process going forward. One thing that's striking about ever since having passed that Electoral Count Act of 1876 is we never had quite the same situation that we had in 1876. We've never had, although we came very close in 2000 with the contested election in Florida, we have yet to have a situation in which a single state has sent more than one slate of presidential electors and ballots from more than one set of presidential electors to the Capitol to be counted. And as a consequence, this process of Congress counting the electoral votes has been a purely ceremonial act in which Congress goes through the process of opening ballots, announcing what's inside, and then tabulating it and simply telling us what we already knew, which is who was elected the president and the vice president, not only on the day in which the presidential electors had met in December in their state capitals and cast their official ballots, but indeed how the general populace had voted on election day in November. What we've seen over the last few years, though, is an increasing willingness of the political parties to tinker with that, to posture in the process of counting electoral votes and to attempt to delegitimate the opposition while scoring points with their own partisan base. Frequently, this has been the Democrats who've organized in Congress to object to counting electoral votes that would have put the Republican presidential candidate over the top. And announced them as president. These have been small votes so far. They've been largely taken as protests of the election of the president. What's striking about this year is both the larger context in which Republicans now did the same thing of contesting the ballots that had been sent to them to be counted. We have the larger context of President Trump organizing a campaign over the course of weeks to denounce the election as stolen and illegitimate, and thus reinforcing what Republicans eventually wanted to do in Congress, refusing to count ballots that had come out of the states. We saw Republican state legislators in cooperation with the Trump campaign organize fraudulent competing slates of presidential electors who were not selected, had never been certified by any official body, had never been voted on by a majority of any state legislature. Nonetheless, they Xeroxed copies of electoral count certificates and forwarded them to Washington as well in order to maintain the pretense that there was a competition of electors and there were serious doubts about who had won the election. And then finally, we saw a tremendous number of Republican politicians in Congress who were willing to vote, at least to set aside the ballots that had arrived in the nation's capital. Fortunately, a very small number of senators. Unfortunately, a very large number of House members in the Republican caucus. We might take this as merely posturing, merely signaling, merely a protest vote to their base, that there's nothing very serious about this, since Republicans do not actually have the votes to be able to overturn the election results as they're counting this process. But I think it shows a very disturbing tendency about where we are. And of course, it raises questions about what exactly the signal is that's being sent to the partisan base by undertaking these kinds of actions. It seems to be a signal that the results of the election are illegitimate, that Joe Biden was not truly elected president. Instead, the election had in fact been stolen. It sends a signal that if enough Republicans are elected to Congress, they would in fact be willing to overturn a presidential election in order to put in place somebody into the White House who in fact did not win the presidential election. This hardly seems like the foundation on which we want to continue to build democracy moving forward. It's an extraordinary signal to be sending to voters down the road. And even more extreme was the suggestion that the vice president unilaterally could simply refuse to count ballots, set them aside in order to overturn the results of election and allow somebody else to win. Fortunately, and I don't think there was much doubt about it, Mike Pence refused to go along with this plan. I don't think there was any serious expectation that Mike Pence would have gone along with such a plan. But the truly extraordinary thing is you had an organized effort out of the White House that floated this idea. And you had members of Congress who were supporting this idea. And then they ultimately sought support from the US Supreme Court to support this idea. No surprise, the court likewise would not go along with this. Ultimately, the success of democracy, including its very basic features of simply counting ballots, depends on elected political officials being willing to adhere to constitutional rules, being able to adhere to the very basic standards of American democracy. And yet, increasingly, what we saw on January 6th was an extraordinary number of Republican politicians who are willing to raise their hand and say, I refuse to comply with the requirements of the Constitution or with what our most basic democratic norms are. And we may think in some ways they weren't very serious because they didn't actually have the power to do anything about it. But I think it's an extraordinarily bad sign about where we are, certainly a bad sign about what the Republican Party is, but I think a bad sign about where we are as a functioning democracy going forward. And that was all before the riot. What's even more remarkable to me, of course, is after the riot, Republicans didn't simply abandon all these plans, but instead continue to go through the same charade, especially in the House of Representatives, where the same number of House members were willing to support this after the riot as were willing to support it before the riot, when it no longer seemed like a mere posturing, a mere protest, a mere dissenting vote, a mere posturing for their own base. Instead, it seemed much more serious, and yet nonetheless, they're continuing to go along with it. Like I said, this is a bad sign. I think that the riot can easily overshadow just how problematic that situation was. And I don't think we should lose sight in the context of actual violence in the Capitol building, just how much legal, metaphorical, and constitutional violence the Republican Party seems to be willing to do to our election processes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Next, we're going to have Jacob Shapiro, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton, focusing on politically motivated violence around the world. He's the author of The Terrorist's Dilemma, Managing Violent Covert Organizations.
Thanks, Louis, and thanks, everyone. I'm going to try and do something a little bit different than my colleagues have done so far, which is rather than put the events into some larger context, speak in a slightly granular way about the ways in which misinformation and social media played into setting the stage for the riots of January 6th. And I think we can think of this broadly as evidence that long-run trends in the media and information environment in our society may be contributing in significant ways to the severity of the issues that my colleagues are raising. And so I want to make 3 points about the events of the 6th. The first is that there are very clear lines of interaction between those supporting the former president's efforts to overturn the elections through lawsuits and what we might think of as legitimate electioneering, the accounts promoting the hashtag Stop the Steal and related hashtags online, the organizers of the January 6th rally, and a number of violent militias that have engaged in activities in many places around the country. And you saw a lot of this in the floating of various terms that would move from one of these populations to the other. The hashtag Stop the Steal first begins showing up in early September, well before the election. It's promoted on a number of websites for about 2 weeks before it begins to be picked up by mainstream Republican organizers and the president himself. After the election, activity around it spikes, and there are actually 2 rallies which involve violence in DC, one November 15th and a second in December, that really set the stage for the January 6th rally. And it's very hard to imagine, if you look at the steady progression of attendance across those 3 rallies, January 6th happening in the absence of this concerted campaign from the president and his allies. So the second point I want to make is this was very much organized in the open to include people talking about using violence, storming the Capitol, and sharing relevant information, such as the approximate location of the congressional subway stops. People talked on public internet fora and on chat rooms on unprotected, not password protected websites about things like bringing Second Amendment supplies, stopping a coup, and the fact that people would likely die on the 6th. And the organizers of the protests put up a number of registration websites where they had images of the ellipse under the heading 9 a.m. and the Capitol Dome under the heading of 1 p.m., all before directing people to a registration website where they could share phone, email, and zip code information in ways that would presumably be useful for marketing and long-run political organizing. And the upshot of this is that there was no failure of intelligence with respect to the activities of January 6th. The Capitol Police and others in DC were briefed about what could happen, and the potential for violence was known, The failure was largely one of executing and responding on that. And that should be both promising and concerning. It should be promising in the sense that this means that when law enforcement and security officials take the threat seriously, this is not some covert thing that is hard to find. This is very much out in the open. But it should also worry us because it's of a piece with the long-term attrition of public policy execution competence in our country that should scare us all. And we see daily evidence of this in the process of the vaccine rollout. Third, and most importantly, a lot of people are making a great deal of money off of this misinformation ecosystem. The people who run the websites and alternative social media platforms on which the conspiracy discussions and misinformation around the election circulated made a great deal of money selling advertising. One good estimate, following 20,000 sites promoting political misinformation in the US and Europe, estimated they pull in $235 million a year in advertising revenue. Now, that's not a huge business, but it's certainly enough to sustain an ecosystem in which many of these ideas will circulate regardless of the action of mainstream political actors. Many of the key actors in the movement further make a great deal of money as social media stars and influencers. And from what can be seen online, the market for lifestyle merchandise around the idea the election was stolen was quite robust and remains so today. Now, we fundamentally don't know how much of the activism around Stop the Steal and related ideas is that kind of grift versus honestly motivated political speech. But what is clear is that this wonderful ecosystem developed to monetize all kinds of creative activity online is now being used to make money off creating an alternative political reality of sorts. And on January 6th, we saw that reality spill over into violence at the Capitol and support all the problematic activities that Keith just took us through in terms of motivating political actors to violate long-held political norms. And I suspect, and this is where I think we should be really worried, that those larger changes may fundamentally reshape the contest that Sean described for us between the populist forces on the one hand and those seeking to ride the tiger to political power on the other. Back to you, Lou.
Thank you. Thank you. And our last member of the panel is Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton. He's the author of Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974, and On Capitol Hill, The Struggle to Reform Congress and Its Consequences, 1948 to 2000. He also writes a weekly column on CNN.com.
Thank you. It's nice to be with Ezra. It's nice to be part of this panel. And I have a few comments that touch on some of the issues a few of my co-panelists have raised. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the state of the Republican Party. In short, the state of the party is not good. And as a result, I think neither is the health of our democracy. I think when I saw January 6th unfold, and as Keith rightly points out, all the events leading up to it, which were equally important, you saw on display, you saw exposed a party that had moved in a pretty extreme direction. And the trial in the Senate ended with the president acquitted. Many people have pointed out that there were 7 Senate Republican votes, which certainly is notable. But I would remind everyone that given the severity of what happened on January 6th, a violent attack on Congress with members and the vice president being threatened, physical harm, if not worse, that's not actually such a high number. And the only way to really understand it is to understand the hold of partisanship on the party in 2021. There's been some interesting polls out. I understand they're limited, but already indicating that there's still relatively strong support for the former president, even after everything that has happened. There was one today, the Politico morning consult that said 59% of Republican voters want the former president to keep playing a big role in the party. 81% of Republican respondents still give him favorable remarks. And I think the mistake sometimes is that we do talk about polarization. I have done this in the growing division between the Democrats and the Republicans since the 1970s and use that as a framework to understand what has happened. But I think January 6th is also about the way polarization has affected the Republican Party in particular. In other words, this has been decades in the making. And Sean and I think, are on the same page. We've seen a Republican Party fundamentally change since the 1980s, a radicalization in its approach to partisanship, a kind of no holds barred, no guardrails kind of partisanship where almost anything is permissible, a radicalization of the policy agenda, and even a radicalization of the kinds of factions that have become part of the coalition. I would argue that the hashtag and Facebook groups and all of that for Stop the Steal would not have amounted to what it did had it not had not only the support, but the active leadership of the former president of the United States and many prominent Republicans, from Senators Hawley and Cruz, who were openly part of this effort to the day of that certification, and Senator McConnell, who now is in a fight with the former president, but for a long time really didn't do much to stop him, and even would give comments about the legitimacy of what he was doing. I think historians are relooking at the history of the Republican Party after the false start of Barry Goldwater, who ultimately was defeated in 1964. We're looking more at how this party evolved. I wrote this book that Sean mentioned on Newt Gingrich in the 1980s, and how he moved from being this outlier in the Republican Party, a young renegade from Georgia, to becoming embraced by the leadership by the end of the 1980s, and officially part of the leadership when he was elected House Minority Whip. And Gingrich was very committed and open and explicit about how much more aggressive his party was going to have to be in what it's willing to say, in the processes it was willing to bend and manipulate and weaponize if they were going to achieve power. And the story of Gingrich in the 80s and then mid-90s continues with the Sarah Palin vice presidential candidacy in 2008. More importantly, the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus during President Obama's term. When you see the Gingrich agenda, the Gingrich model is accelerated, it's intensified, it's strengthened, culminating in the presidency of Donald Trump. I am one who argues that Trump wasn't really an outlier. He wasn't an aberration. He was the culmination of many decades when the party had changed, and he essentially exposes what much of the party had become. I think the mistake in 2016 was to think that Jeb Bush was the establishment and Donald Trump was the maverick. I think we had the story reversed. And I think that's why some Republicans like Senator Romney now found themselves really with few allies in the party at this point in time. Political scientists call this asymmetric polarization. It's a useful term. And basically it says, yes, both parties have polarized, both parties have more extremes in their party, but as a whole, Republicans move to the right more than Democrats as a whole move to the left. Republicans as a whole have been willing to be much more, again, aggressive in their partisanship, fewer concerns about governance and the health of our institutions than Democrats. We see that with Biden versus Trump matchup as really embodying some of the fundamental differences of where the party has moved. And I think this forces us to reckon with this. It's a problem. It's a problem, obviously, in terms of how does the Republican Party continue and survive if it's in this form, but it's a problem for our democracy. If you have one party that has become so radicalized at the top and so extreme in the ways that we have seen, it makes governance extraordinarily difficult, as I think President Biden is probably going to discover. And it also threatens some of the underlying health of our democratic institutions. So January 6th was not only a horrific moment for all of us to watch and to watch again during the impeachment trial in the Senate, but a real wake-up call to the changes that have been happening since the 1980s, and a moment to have serious conversations about where do we go from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for everybody's comments. I'd like to start it off with a question really for anybody on the panel, and feel free if several folks want to take a crack at it. One question that's been very hard for me, and I'm sure a lot of people to grasp, is there a past period of political division that compares to what we're seeing now? Is January 6th and the events leading up to it, is that unprecedented? Is it precedented but different in some ways? Is it an echo? I'm just trying to get a 30,000-foot view here of the big picture in where January 6th fits into U.S. history.
Well, Sean and I are the 19th century historians.
Yeah, right. Without being too direct about it, I mean, in 1860-61, a bunch of Southerners refused to accept the election of a president, Abraham Lincoln, and it led to secession. In 2020-21, a political party refused to acknowledge the election of a president, and it led to violence at the Capitol. Now, you know, the scale of what's going on today, we don't know what the scale is going on today. As Julian said, we're going to have to find out. But I think, and I wonder if Nell will agree, that some of the fault lines we're seeing today, you know, I'm not trying to say this is the Civil War about to happen. Please, don't get me wrong. But there are certain fault lines and there are certain homologies between what happened then, not least, in fact, the question of race, between what happened then and what happened now.
Well, you put your finger on it, Sean. It is the question of race. And the last time we had this kind of ferment on a national level, it was around slavery. Mm-hmm. And it led to the Civil War, and it finally led to Reconstruction, and Reconstruction redeemers got away with a lot of terrorism. I think what we need to remember here is that you have to admit the importance of Black votes in order to pull us out, that the other side is terrorism. And that's what I mean about colorizing American democracy. We know, going back to the 1830s, that there was a lot of mob violence on the local levels. There was the driving out of Chinese in the West. There were attacks and burnings of abolitionists. I'm sure you're going to be doing some of that in your new book. So our American history is full of racial violence. But up to now, it has been considered a Black problem and not been taken seriously.
Does anybody else feel like they want to weigh in on that question?
I would just add that I've been saying for some time that increasingly our politics looks like 19th century politics. We've become sort of familiar with how politics worked in the latter part of the 20th century, and that sort of has established our norms in lots of ways about our expectations about how politics is conducted. The 19th century looked very different. I mean, it was deeply polarized in the kinds of ways that Julian emphasized. There was a lot more willingness to break with expected patterns about how institutions worked and to change the rules of the game in important ways, to bend if not break a lot of rules and remake institutions in fundamental ways. That was particularly true at the state level and state level politics, but it was also true at the national level and national level politics. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now. And of course, we have this very deep racial fissure that was characteristic of 19th century politics. It was characteristic after 19th century politics as well. But we're returning to, I think, some of that, where we're going to see play at some of the same basic passions and instincts that people wanted to play with earlier in American history, and ultimately is very dangerous.
I would say, I mean, when 19th century, that period of the 19th century is the point of comparison, we have a problem on our hands. It's not a historical moment we look to, oh, this has happened before, so we're okay, but just the opposite. And I would add one thing, is that I do think what Jacob was talking about, the media, both social media, news media, the power of this information flow is greater than what we had in the 19th century. So the ability to spread toxic messaging, the ability of these kind of right-wing militia organizations, which is what they are, to communicate at an international level, let alone a national level, it's pretty astounding how fast and unfiltered it is. And I think that adds a whole layer to how much danger and dysfunction this can cause.
I don't think it's a new layer, but it's a cranking up. The use of the means of communication. I took you back to my dissertation. And one of the things that really scandalized me, I was so innocent. I was sitting reading newspapers, I think in Texas, and I thought, these people are lying. They are publishing lies.
Right.
Okay. I thought I'd maybe start addressing this to Keith, but feel free if anybody wants to jump in as well. Now that we've seen the end of impeachment in the Senate, was impeachment in a Senate trial the best way to address the actions? Or was there, or could there have been a better way?
Well, I don't think it's going to be the only way that we have to do it. Impeachment, I think, was the appropriate way of doing it. And I think partially we revealed what we already knew, which is it's extraordinarily difficult to successfully impeach and remove a president. With the advent of political parties, impeachment already had been transformed, I think, into a very difficult mechanism for these kinds of purposes. But what I've also struck by is just how badly we do the impeachment process. We've now done it twice with just one president, and both of them were not handled very well at all, even laying aside what the final votes look like, given the substantive merits. I don't think that's actually reassuring about how well we're going to do it outside the impeachment context either, right? So now we're talking about trying to have some kind of 9/11 type commission that can investigate what happened. You would hope that would be a serious bipartisan effort and there'd be serious engagement. I'm not currently very optimistic about how well that's going to go, how well it's going to reveal the truth about what happened, how well the message is going to get out about what happened. And I think all those things are critically important.
Okay. Wanted to shift over to Professor Shapiro. Is the idea of people on different sides living in different information universes something unprecedented? And do you see any way to reverse the trend?
So we certainly have to turn to our historian friends for better information than I have on how precedented it is. My sense is that it's actually much better now than it was historically, that historically the access to partisan media was, it was like much harder to get a diverse set of media. You know, one of the interesting things about this is that on average, people seem to consume a fairly diverse media diet. The best work on this has been done by our colleague Andy Guess, who's shown that there are a small number of people at the extremes who consume highly partisan media diets, but that the vast majority of people see a fairly diverse set of things. And when people have actually gone out and systematically tracked all the different pieces of news someone sees over the course of a day, there's like an amazing study that did this recently in Science. They found that the sites that are really out there, disinformation sites, things like, you know, Gateway Pundit or, you know, things like that, they're like an almost invisible portion of people's overall media diets for the vast majority of Americans. And so I think the question of like people being in filter bubbles is a different question from these technologies enabling the people on the fringe in geographically distributed areas to more easily find each other and convince each other that there is a larger movement behind fringe ideas than there actually is, which then leads them to take risky action like we saw on the 6th, which is gonna, you know, it's gonna end terribly for most of the people who went into the Capitol. But they went into it thinking they were the vanguard of something much larger than they actually were.
Right.
Yeah. So that's actually somewhat of an optimistic take then?
I mean, I think so. I'm actually much more concerned with the partisanship at the leadership level than I am about the actions of people down at the bottom, because the activity, the organizing activity is so public that there's no way it can get intensely violent without being reined in by the police.
Let's see. I thought maybe Julian might take this first, but feel free to add your thoughts if anybody else wants to. 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now, what power do you think Donald Trump will have over his party or the country, or that maybe his family will have over the party or the country?
Can't believe I didn't get a history question. I could look forward. I mean, at one level, I think kind of connected to what I said, he will have a lot of power because though he is an extreme version of modern republicanism, he is rooted in the modern Republican Party. So I don't foresee the party shifting that much. There might be louder and more organized outliers, which is what I consider someone like Romney at this point. But much of the party is exactly where it stands today. And so Trumpism, if that's what it's called, is a form, it's really republicanism as it has evolved right now. And in that respect, he will still have great standing. I don't know where he is. I do think, he could have a lot of sway. I'm not convinced he has the stomach to stay in this and won't kind of move on to something else, trying to make money, television, dealing with all these criminal and lawsuits, that he is going to face. But the first point, I think, is the more important one. And at some level, we have to disconnect what's happening from Donald Trump, as hard as that is, if we're really going to have a sense of what's going on and why the party just was engaged in what it did.
Can I add, I'm adding on to what Keith was talking about in terms of what happened on the morning of January 6th. I mean, look, there are all sorts of people inside the Republican Party who are jockeying to become Donald Trump. Right. Senator Cruz, Senator Hawley, they're ready, they're waiting and ready. And it's not even about Trump, it's the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the Trump party now. That's what people have to get their head around. It's not simply a cult of personality. It in part is that for his followers, but there are plenty of people out there who'd be happy to run basically on a Trump program, on a Trump platform, on demagoguery of that kind. I don't see the question you're raising, Lewis, is not so much one of what the future of Trump is. The question is, what is the future of the Republican Party? And I think that's very much what we're seeing now.
I have a question, and it really is a question. I'm thinking about the outpouring of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans in the middle of last year, anti-racist activity. And there was a real mobilization and an awakening. I wonder if that is temporary. I hope not. And I think that the Biden-Harris ticket, in fact, says that it's not, and that Democrats are betting on it's not. But one of the polarizing issues is between what I call the colorized democracy, that is the democracy of voting, which is Black, mm-hmm. and the democracy of fear and terrorism, which is white. And Trump has his hands on that white democracy. And it's not, I mean, there are people in that Trump democracy who are not white, who perhaps don't like immigrants or don't like feminists. But by and large, it is a white nationalist party.
I think Jacob wanted to add a thought here.
Yeah, I just want to respond on something that Margaret McGlynn asked in the Q&A, which is whether we should think about this as being a substantially greater capacity for organizing on the right than on the left. And, Nell raised a social movement over the summer, which drew out orders of magnitude more people than the MAGA rallies ever did, and sustained that over a number of weeks. And so I don't think we should take what happened on the 6th as evidence that there is some partisan advantage to organizing online or working in the new ecosystem on the right compared to the left. There's clearly a change in the capacity on both sides mm-hmm. to get people out in coordinated fashion. What I think the discussion has revealed is the two sides have somewhat different theories about how to work with that and how to turn that into policies that they would like.
Yeah, very much.
Can I raise just a bit of a pessimistic note, though, on all of this? The pessimistic note isn't the strength of what you were talking about, Nell. I think it's very strong. And I think it's going to, it is a major force, and it's a transformed force. Very different about what are we going to call it, the left-hand side of the equation than it was a year ago. Things have changed, and I think changed profoundly. However, it's not for nothing that the Latin vote for Trump went up. And it wasn't for nothing that actually the Black vote for Trump went up.
That's true.
There is something in Trumpism which is not just about the white nationalist piece.
This is true.
In the Republican Party, and I'm going to call it the Republican Party, that goes beyond what Trump's appeal might be. And that, I think, is something that should be worrisome, not just for Democrats, of which I am proudly one, but for the country at large, because coalition is really in formation. It's not finished, it's in formation.
Right.
And how the Democrats handle that process is something that I think is going to have a lot to do with how we move forward.
Right.
So I think we have to see this as a point of what? Not transition exactly, but we're in a point where we're not, it ain't finished yet.
Right.
And that's what concerns me.
Yeah, but the question is, how important, say, are voting rights for the Democratic Party?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, look,
where is it on the list of priorities?
Yeah, I think it has to be number one. Frankly, I've been saying this for a long time. I mean, we are back in, it is Jim Crow we're talking about. We're talking about a voting rights suppression. Look, the one thing that the Republican Party has gotten very, very good at is voter suppression.
Yep.
And that's what's keeping it alive in many places, including large parts of the South. It's voter suppression. So that has to be, I think, and if we're going to keep American democracy, in the end, I think this force we're seeing is going to be defeated by the American voters. It's not going to be defeated by something going on in Washington. It's not going to be defeated in the courts, obviously. The people themselves are going to have to do it.
And that's a crucial inflection point about what we emphasize as we talk about what is important in politics.
Yes, I agree.
I talked about mediatization, and that's really important. But the new technologies of communication are really important. But I think voting rights is much more fundamental.
But I mean, I think
I
agree with all of that. I think one of the challenges for the movement, certainly, if we're talking of this as a holistic movement at the national level, is it is going to run up against both the procedures and rules that make big legislation extraordinarily difficult these days, especially a kind of 60 majority expectation in the Senate because of the filibuster, and a party, and generally the Republican Party has not been on the side of the protests that unfolded this summer, that is pretty determined to obstruct. On voting rights, for example, it's not going to be an easy haul.
Which do you want to emphasize? Which do you want to talk about the most?
Well, I'm saying it will be difficult. I mean, one of the challenges for the movement will be to continue when legislative progress is extraordinarily difficult. It naturally frustrates any activist. You see this on gun control, for example, where it peters out after a while because nothing is happening. So I think that's where the Washington story is going to be relevant to the kind of success and expansion of some of these movements.
Okay, let me share one of our audience members' questions. They directed it to let's see, Nell and Sean. They were wondering if they could comment on the recent suit under the KKK Civil Rights Act, its history and meaning and probability of success, whatever that may mean.
You go for it now. This is
Okay.
right up your alley.
I did not read the news today, so I don't, and this is today's news.
Yes.
So I don't have the details. I'm sorry, I was in a board meeting all day. But when my husband mentioned it, I said, it's the Ku Klux Klan Act, 1872. No, I was wrong. It's the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871.
Right.
So, in a sense, this kind of puts a bow on what I just said to you about the links between that anti-democratic, anti-voting rights racist, white nationalist, Confederate, all that together, wave of terrorism that ended Reconstruction. As long as the end of Reconstruction remains Black history and not American history, we will not understand what has happened in our country as a whole.
I'm not quite sure what happened with the, who was proposed using the KKK Act?
I believe it was Benny Thompson, the congressman, Democrat from Mississippi.
Well, I mean,
Join.
I've said January 6th, one of the things that brought to mind January 6th was precisely the presidency of Ulysses Grant, which is in many ways more relevant today than ever before, perhaps. People think of it in terms of corruption, and
No.
all that stuff. No, it was essentially about Reconstruction. And, and Merrick Garland, actually, when he was his appointment was announced, actually referred to this.
Oh, really?
The Department of Justice was actually founded by Ulysses S. Grant in order to break the Ku Klux Klan, among other things.
Yeah.
And all of the people that he appointed. So in fact, there is a question people have been asking. I don't know about this particular one, the use of the KKK Act, but there's a question of how you're going to deal with, how the Justice Department is going to deal, not with Donald Trump, but to deal with the militias and to deal with this right-wing violence that is really, it is the number one threat. People have said it. Domestic terrorism is the number one threat, and it's coming from them. There, I think there is a model in the 1870s. It didn't work out in the end, but he did break the Klan for a while.
Yep.
And that was because of the force of the federal government, and only the federal government can do that. And and I think this is something that I hope that the president and the attorney general, once he actually gets ratified, gets put in, think about seriously. And because this is about, now this is really a matter of public safety as much as anything else. We cannot allow this to go on. And so I think, hooray for Ulysses S. Grant.
I'm skeptical about
the 50. I'm glad he's still on the $50 bill.
Yeah.
Are you feeling optimistic? There have now been a couple hundred people arrested for the Capitol riot. Is that going to make an appreciable difference to some of this fringe, as they were called earlier in the conversation?
Are you asking me that, Lewis?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's fine what they're doing, but I think it's going to take a much more systemic system. Look, this has been going on since 1995. It's
been going on since 1872.
Well, yeah. But I'm talking about the present incarnation of this.
Yeah.
I got to Timothy McVeigh, and I wrote a piece back in 1995, which I could have written today.
Yeah.
What's feeding all of this stuff? And it is a long history. Yes, it goes all the way back to, the very beginning of the country. But I think that this has to now be more than just arresting people for what has been done, and it's preventing things that could be done and things that will be done unless the federal government takes a very strong stand. And it can't be done with, it has to be done very quietly. It has to be done in the ways that the FBI operates. But I think it's a very strong priority for the Justice Department. Not about the things that are out there that were obvious, the things that are. This was not followed up anywhere near enough after 1995, and we're paying the price for it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to have the details of the legislation and of the policy statements, but over and over and over again, people from the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League have been talking to Congress since 1986 about this. And over again, the Department of Justice would not include white terrorism, white nationalism, domestic terrorism as part of the portfolio of dealing with unrest in the United States.
I wanted to share another audience question, since we have a good selection of 19th century scholars here. Does it make sense to discuss how the Whig Party passed away as a point of comparison or contrast with the GOP of today?
I guess that's for me. Well, look, the Whig Party cracked up over slavery, and the Southern Whigs and the Northern Whigs can no longer get along.
Yeah.
So to the extent that what's going inside the Republican Party today is about some of those issues, I suppose you could sort of say that. But No, I think we're in a different universe politically than we were then. I don't think it's about that. There are too many reruns you can do too easily. As I say, I'm much more drawn to what happened to the country than what happened to the Whig Party. That is to say, I'm looking much more to the secession winter than I am to 1854 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Yeah.
But I think there's a point to be made is that parties are not permanent. There's nothing permanent necessarily about a political party. And political parties have been known to die in American history. The Federalist Party was the regnant party at the nation's founding.
Yeah.
Right? The Whig Party, it was hanging in there. It was doing all right. It elected a couple of presidents. It died. So these parties are not forever. The Constitution does, as Keith and others can say, does kind of structure things so the two parties seem to be, written into the system, but it's not necessarily going to be the same parties. And I think it's entirely possible that one of these two parties, and I'm not necessarily saying the Democratic Party wouldn't be this one, but there's nothing immemorial about political parties.
Right.
It's much more, sorry, go ahead.
I agree with Sean that the Whig breakup was only tangential to what we're seeing now.
I think, though, right now, and others can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure the Republican Party is so organizationally weak that it's anywhere near that. I think its resources are still formidable. It still has a lot of strength, certainly at the state and local level, and obviously on Capitol Hill. They don't have the majority, but they're still it's a narrow majority the Democrats have. So in terms of the muscle of the party and even the votes that the former president pulled, it should kind of be some sign that we're not going to have a Whig event happening anytime soon. I think that's part of the era that we're in, where these parties are quite formidable, even if one is moving in a pretty extreme direction.
And also, there are all kinds of things. Oh, sorry.
I think what's going to make a big difference is that I use Stacey Abrams as a kind of symbolic figure, but the kind of grassroots organizing she did is what it will take to make a big change in our American politics, I think. And to get the parties or party to fund that and to keep it going. I mean, Stacey Abrams was at it. She's not the only one in Georgia. She's the figure that you can see. They were at it for 10 years. So it's not a glamorous overnight kind of activity. And it's a grassroots politics of the kind we haven't seen before. I mean, I would be interested to hear, say, from Jacob, about how the technologies, the internet, could be used not just to reach millions of people, but also to foster grassroots organizing and focusing on local issues.
So I'm happy to speak to that to the extent that I can now, and it's clear when you look across many countries around the world that as internet penetration goes up and as social media companies move in and new areas gain access, that all kinds of collective action go up. Mm-hmm. Benign protests go up, violent protests goes up, terrorism goes up, like lots of things that involve collective action go up. What does seem to go down, there are a couple of very good studies which show this in Europe and Africa, are the traditional community localized forms of social capital. And that's concerning. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's some trade-offs there. Yeah. What seems clear from the events of the summer, though, is that these technologies, like they don't privilege one set of politics. Mm-hmm. Right? They're enabling everyone to organize more, and that may suggest a greater potential for grassroots activity to snap onto certain topics than has historically been the case.
Yeah. Yeah. One big issue up here in the Adirondacks is rural broadband. This is a very rural area, and people are not well served with broadband. If that were to change, and people have been talking about it for ever since Obama. If that were to change, maybe it would make a difference in the kind of voter turnout and the level of political discourse.
I've got another question from the audience. Quote, my fellow hardcore liberals and I have long felt that the Democratic Party doesn't serve lower and middle class Americans of all races sufficiently. Do they bear some responsibility for the resentment behind the rise of Trumpism?
I actually missed the first part. Can you?
Oh, sorry.
I'm happy to take it unless someone else does.
Who
bears responsibility?
So, basically saying that I guess the audience member says, my fellow hardcore liberals and I have long felt the Democratic Party does not serve lower and middle class Americans of all races sufficiently. Do they bear some responsibility for
It's not clear how much the Trump movement actually led people to switch parties, particularly. And so there was certainly some thought in 2016 and there is clearly some shared energy between the Bernie movement and the Trump movement in 2016. But there was some real thought that you'd have some substantial realignment that would occur with the election of Trump. He would draw in a lot of Democrats who did feel exactly the way the questioner suggested. People felt like they weren't being served by the Democratic Party. I just don't think we've seen it in practice. Instead, what Trump did to a degree that really has surprised me is consolidated Republican support around him. And he's drawn a little bit of Democratic support, and likewise he shed some Republicans who are not willing to support Trump. But it's not evident that we're getting that there's some severe disaffection within the Democratic Party, and Trump has been able to exploit that and draw a lot of voters to him. And it's no evidence, I think, that we're looking at that in the coming years.
And I mean, it's true that both parties have had problems dealing with certain core economic issues, which is part of what the question is. And neither have addressed sufficiently issues of inequality and economic insecurity. But I mean, first of all, that has been a problem for a while, but we haven't seen one of the parties then kind of, really mobilize masses and groups and organizations into organized violence as a response to that. So that just happened. It didn't happen the whole time. It's not a new problem. We teach about it often. And that doesn't explain really kind of the strategy. This was a strategy. I mean, I think when I was listening to Keith, I think he is onto something that got lost even in the impeachment at some point trial, that it wasn't just about the speech the morning of January 6th. It was about how the whole certification, the whole election, the former president was organizing an effort to challenge the results. Like in September, he was raising money to do it. So this was a party strategy, and that's what we're talking about. And so I think that's the difference with what the question is saying. And we have to see that also not as an inevitable outgrowth of, limited or failed economic policies.
And it's fundamentally a constitutional issue in the end, which is what Keith was talking about. I mean, it seems that one party does not care about the United States Constitution very much. This is alarming. It's not just about partisanship. It's about, basic patriotism or loyalty to the Constitution. I mean, and apparently that's out the window as far as a large or the leading sector of the Republican Party is concerned, right? Is that right, Keith? Did I hear?
No, I find it very alarming, right? And I thought I was less alarmed, I think, soon after the election, when it seemed like it was primarily the Trump campaign and whoever he could scrape together to help him, which was not, for the most part, mainstream party leaders or mainstream established politicians. What I found very disturbing by the end of the process was the extent to which elected political officials from the Republican Party were willing to sign on, which really began, I thought, with the Texas lawsuit and the Republican House members signing an amicus brief in support of it, which was really a sort of dramatic move by the part of elected Republican officials to say, yeah, we're on board with what Trump had largely been doing on his own. And then we've seen it now with state legislators. We see it affect some senators. And so by the very end of the process, he had really pulled in a tremendous number of Republican Party officials and Republican political leaders in a way that I think is just really alarming about what the future looks like.
So actually would love to pose a question. I think this is for Julian about 20th century American history. And, we had a time not so long ago that there were loads of senators and members of the House on the Democratic side of the aisle who were happy to make common cause with people engaging in terrorism, right, against the African-American populations in the South. And that is no longer acceptable, obviously, in the Democratic Party. And so that's a change. And I'm very curious what we know about how that change happened. Like, was it people aging out? Was it that the change in Republican strategy meant it was no longer effective electorally? Like, what was the process that moved a large body of the Democratic Party from being willing to make common cause with such folks to viewing them as anathema and beyond the pale?
Well, I'm happy. I mean, oh, sorry, Nell, go ahead.
Sorry. The Voting Rights Act, Strom Thurmond, all those Democrats became Republicans.
This was the heart of the Southern strategy that the Republicans capitalized on a backlash to Civil Rights Act of 64, the VRA in 65, the open housing battle of open housing legislation between 66 and 68. Some Democrats lost their seat in the North, like Paul Douglas. But the whole point of the strategy, which Nixon is eager to capitalize on, is to capture the South. It's to make this area, which had gradually been changing, but to really accelerate that and make it Republican territory. Newt Gingrich is a product of this when John Flint, the Democrat, kind of old school Democrat, retires and he takes his seat. And you see this throughout the region. And I mean, that is the story that is kind of most important of this period.
As a footnote to that, though, it didn't just begin in 64. There's going back to 48 and to Strom Thurmond. I mean,
right, the Dixiecrats.
The Democratic Party coming out of the New Deal, Hubert Humphrey being one example, that we're standing by civil rights, out of this the shadow of states' rights into the sunshine of equal rights, of civil rights. So the Democratic Party had been the party of segregation, had been the party of redemption, and it ceased to be that. But it ceased to be that out of a process, I think, that didn't happen all at once. It was a process that occurred in the 1920s, and FDR had a lot to do with it, in terms of rejiggering where the center of the Democratic Party was going to be. And the 1964, that had really, and pushed by the Civil Rights Movement, really had put that, in a different place.
Right. Well, I take the thrust of Jake's question in part about a very specific component of what was allies, say, to the Democratic Party during this period, which were people willing to engage in political violence in order to suppress the vote, right? And those people don't just transition into becoming Republicans, right? There's no functional equivalent of that, of the kind of bloody violence that we were seeing in the 50s and early 1960s that sort of continues into the Republican South going forward. That does get marginalized and sort of rejected out of the political system for a while, depending on how you think about some of the 60 activism later, where the Weather Underground and the like is in fact still around and engaging in lots of political violence and is not completely marginalized by both political parties, right? But we do go through this window where there's not a lot of.
I'm not sure the violence really disappeared as much as all that. It was quieted down, but I mean, there was plenty of, Birmingham, Alabama was known as Bombingham, Alabama in the 1950s. And the Klan was there, just that they had the power, so they didn't have to use it so much. They didn't have to redeem anything because they had been, quote unquote, redeemed. I think that the fear of violence in American politics has always been there, and it's never gone away. It's just that there are points where it's much more, visible when things get desperate and things get, nasty, and that's what we're facing today, I think.
Yeah. And the issue they get nasty about is votes.
Yeah, that was what the Klan was about, right? Essentially. I mean, it was about a lot of things, but it was
It's about a
essentially,
lot of things, yeah.
yeah.
Economic
Means
competition.
that example of political
competition.
violence, there's lots of other
Look.
political violence we've had across American history that's not attached to votes, right? It's attached to other things, ideologies, policy desires, other kinds of concerns. And, you know, I do think we're at a moment where we got violence that's attached to votes, but it's not the only form of
usually
political
it's
violence
both.
we get.
There's
Usually-
also,
But a lot of it is economic, that's true. Economic competition,
Right.
particularly in the West. But
Mm.
a lot of it is about votes.
I mean, you also have ebbs and flows in how much attention the federal government and the executive branch is paying to this. And
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
the story, I think Sean mentioned of 95 in Oklahoma City, there's a big push then after to deal with right-wing, white extremist organizations. There's more resources, although the Clinton administration actually has to overcome Republican opposition, including people like Barr, Congressman Barr of Georgia, were very resistant to wiretapping phones, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's now been a decline during the Trump years in money committed to this. So in addition to the macro story, there are changes that happen. And I think there's kind of a real dismantling, certainly in recent years, of federal efforts to go after these groups. And we'll know, I mean, I can speculate why, we all can, but we'll learn more of why those cuts were made, given we know the severity of the threat.
I
So what
wanted
I
to
was saying about the Justice Department now, I mean, that they have to pick up where the Clinton administration left off, that now has to be picked up in a big way, I think.
I thought I'd share another question from the audience. Maybe for Jacob. What can we learn from looking at the nationalist populist movements in non-US context? Are we different significantly from that? Therefore, can't learn that much, or are there some echoes?
You know, unfortunately, I can't say much on that because I've only worked on the most violent parts of those movements. You know, what I can say is that you know, there are many mature, wealthy democracies that have learned to live with levels of political violence that are much greater than what we see today in the United States, and like they got through it just fine.
Like what?
The United Kingdom, Spain, France at many periods, Germany during parts of the 70s. So you know, this is not this you know, small amounts of political violence are not an existential threat to a wealthy democracy. They're tragic and unfortunate and should be avoided, but I don't think we need to be worried that these things will suddenly scale up into societal scale insurrection or something like that.
It already has. Here. It already has.
Yes, fair. Yes, fair on the six,
What did we just see? Right.
but you know, something more widespread occurring in larger numbers.
Well, it wouldn't be, you know, the Northern Ireland. I mean, we're not talking about Northern Ireland, you know, happening right now, but there's many kinds of ways in which, right, Jacob, I mean, there's lots of ways you do political violence, and it's not just the violence of political violent groups. I mean, it's not just what they do violently. It's how they can organize an entire, you know, society, if you want to put it that way. It's the threat, it's the fear, it's that's out there that can be very, very nasty.
And I think, look, violence is obviously the worst, one of the worst threats there is, but there's other problems we're talking about that framed the violence. And so the battle over certification and over our basic transfer of power, it's a problem. If you have leaders who are not going to play by those rules, even if it didn't result in a violent day on January 6th, it was already incredibly problematic. The kind of willingness to use disinformation on very pertinent areas of policy, like the fact, you know, that we're in a pandemic and we normally heard things that weren't true coming from the White House. That's a problem. It's a problem that really does undermine our governing capacity as a country. And I don't think we should take it lightly, either by saying, well, we've had other times that were bad or other countries have gotten through it. I think we should see this has enormous ramifications on the health of our democracy.
I think we're coming to a close, about 5 minutes left. Thought I would ask one more question. do you see any political figures or even any public figures at all who can inspire trust and support of a wide swath of people in this country? And kind of related to that, are you optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to find a national purpose?
We don't have a national purpose. We have national ideals, but we're a country of what, 340 million people. There's no way we can all agree, but we do have certain guiding, we can call them myths, that characterize the country, and democracy is one of them.
I am a little pessimistic, though, about the emergence of a figure who can really claim genuine bipartisan support across a broad swath of the public. I just don't think we're in a moment where people can do that. And anyone who looks like they might have that kind of appeal will soon get subjected to partisan forces such that it tears that down, and they become a partisan figure rather than a much broader figure. So to the extent we're relying on individuals to bridge that particular gap, and particularly maybe one particular leader that can bridge that gap, I'm not very optimistic we're going to see something like that.
Without trying to sound too partisan, though, I think that if this figure emerges, this figure will emerge out of the Democratic Party. And the reason is because of what's happened to the Republican parties, which has been a theme throughout our conversations. I mean, if you have a political party that's no longer going to want to support the U.S. Constitution, well, then the figure who's going to stand to bring people together, who will not get universal support, there's nobody's going to get universal support, but who will get, who can be a kind of, leader, a national leader. It's going to have to come out of the Democratic Party. I truly believe that. And I say that not because I'm a Democrat. I say that because, as an historian, there are times when we were talking before about parties don't just only break up, they also mutate. As the Democratic Party mutated with Jacob, from being the party of segregation to being the party of civil rights. The Republican Party is mutated into becoming what it's become. Well, the Democratic Party also faces a crossroads. It's also at a place where it has to figure out what it's going to be. And I think that, but I do think that to answer the question of the questioner, that's where the person's going to come from, whoever she is.
I mean, my optimism always stems from what people are going to do who aren't the leaders and the kind of pressure they will put on them. Part of the answer back to Jacob's question, in addition to the liberal lions like Hubert Humphrey, was the civil rights movement that simply changed what was acceptable and what was unacceptable, and put immense pressure in the 60s. And that's why Washington changed. And the two moments of optimism for me, one was in the summer, back to Nell's point, when you saw a lot of protesters in the middle of this pandemic, when we all had shut down so badly, come out and insist on a human rights moment in terrible conditions and kind of ignite our politics again. It was the first time politics came back outside of the pandemic, and it was an important moment. And then all the people, I mean, yes, it was primarily a Democratic effort who made this election happen. I mean, the horrible thing, another horrible thing of January 6th is we forget the election worked. It was a pandemic. We didn't know how people were going to vote. And we had really great numbers. And we had kids from our university and elsewhere canvassing and making sure that this thing worked, that this democratic moment happened. And for me, those two moments are reason to have some optimism that there are people out there. I don't know their name, but they are out there and they are going to keep politicians' feet to the fire, and they have the capacity to change us for the better. And that was reason for optimism in my mind.
Well, let's close on this reason for optimism right now. We are at the end of our time. I want to thank all the panelists for joining, and for all of our viewers, wherever you are in the country. I really appreciate it. And that is our program for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.